one of RuneScape's biggest challenges, to craft your own theater of blood. Let's begin. I'm so excited, man.
Hey, and welcome. I'm going to assume right off the bat that most people here are more familiar with RuneScape than what I'm doing. So because of this, I'll try to describe things as if I'm the swamp man himself. The main material I'm working with is extruded polystyrene, or XPS foam. This is also known as insulation foam and is used in construction. The construction wiki lists this as giving 0 XP, and you can get it from the Grand Home Depot or Lowe's exchanges. The cost is roughly $57 or 300 mil in RS gold on the black market for a 4 foot by 8 foot, 2 inch thick piece, or basically more than you'll ever need in your entire life. The large tool you see me using frequently is a Proxxon hot wire cutter. This is just a wire that heats up and slices through the foam like butter. You can adjust the heat on the wire for more precise cuts, but at a lower temperature it's much harder to cut, and then at the higher temperatures it melts the foam, so you're trying to find a good middle ground. The Proxxon is considered best in slot for working with the foam. I use box cutter in the offhand slot for smaller cuts and cleanup cuts, and I do equip a respirator in the helm slot when I'm making a large amount of cuts with the wire cutter. XPS foam when cut will release a toxic gas that isn't curable with anti-venom, so it's always good to wear one of these or you're going to end up in Lumbee in real life. What you've been seeing me doing on screen is mapping out the size and scale. Instead of measuring, I tend to make everything off of a visual reference. In order to do this, I pick out a relatively large but easy to make portion of the build. Once that's made, I make the rest of the pieces using that as a reference. So I first started with the structures that jut out, which have the sculptures on them, then I mapped out the general size of everything with a series of blocks. Once I was confident that each piece is relatively close to proportionate scale, I moved on to making the details. There are a ton of tiny geometric shapes, so figuring out how to make these took most of the time. I added in additional stone textures using aluminum foil. I wanted to balance the build being true to the game, but with additional details and realism added in, so you'll see that I added in additional textures that aren't present in the game, but mostly make sense with the build. I placed each piece using a pair of tweezers. If I learned one thing from Swampletics, it's that old school viewers really enjoy watching people torture themselves. For the windows, I cut out a piece of cardboard in their shape, and I made an impression on the foam, which I then carved out. You can see I originally thought to cut the shape out of a thin piece of foam, and I honestly probably would have done that had I thought about this going into it, but instead of being someone that plans and does things like a normal person, I decided to just go and fix and move forward, making everything infinitely harder for myself because I am a dumbass. One of the unexpectedly good things about the Proxxon melting foam when it cuts, if you have a large amount of small pieces where you're trying to make something like bricks, it will actually fuse them together as it cuts, allowing you to continuously make more and more of those bricks without having to move them around, and then they can be pulled apart easily. I do a mixture of using individual bricks as well as carving bricks out for where it makes the most sense. So originally I thought I was going to be using individual bricks here, but decided to go ahead and carve them out because adding in the additional bricks made it a little bit too big to where the windows came down. So that's why I decided to move and adjust as I was going. I use a pencil to widen the gap because just a cut is almost not visible, and the pencil also bevels the edge to give it a cooler look. So here you can see what the two techniques look like side by side, where the carved bricks are a bit cleaner and the individual bricks give a bit of a more realistic look because of the imperfections. As you can see, I dry fit everything together as I'm going so I can make sure the scale stays looking correct. This is because I'm not measuring. If I was measuring, I could just build and save myself a lot of time, but as I mentioned previously, total dumbass. I struggled a bit making an archway because I have permanent jad hands. You can see that I kind of messed up the cut on the arch. So in order to fix this, I used a different material, which is called EVA foam. This is the stuff that people usually use to build cosplays, but it works perfectly here because it's a bit more flexible, and if you hit it with a heat gun, it will hold its shape that you mold it to. I realized that when I glued some of the pieces in place, I actually glued them not in the same way that I dry fit them, so it messed with the entire scale. So I had to rip these apart. Luckily, I used hot glue, which comes apart relatively easy. You actually can't use super glue with this type of foam because of a chemical reaction that causes it to melt. Here you can see me doing some of the technical cuts with the Proxxon that are much harder than doing with just a knife. So if you hold the foam at an angle and then cut it, you can make a nice beveled edge. Also, turning off the proxon will stop the cuts immediately, allowing me to do this effect where I hollowed out the inside of this pillar. You can also see that the proxon will cut through hot glue as long as it's not too thick. It really just melts it down. This allowed me to make the back of the pillar completely flat so I could glue it on flush to the wall. At this point, you're probably thinking, hey, this guy's just making the Theater of Blood entrance. How is this considered a Swampletics diorama? Well, part 1 of this series is just the entrance because, like most things with Old School, it ended up taking way longer than I originally anticipated. The next part, I intend to sculpt a lot of different things from the original series out of clay to put in a scene in the courtyard along with the Swampy Boy himself. Just to give you an example of things that I'm thinking of are things like everyone's favorite reoccurring character, the old boot, and other things along those lines that would be kind of arranged in that courtyard. I have a pretty long list of things that I want to make, but if you have any ideas or things that you would like to see, just let me know in the comments because I'm still in the process of making all of these things.
What is RuneScape about if not about setting goals and accomplishing them?
Now let's talk goals. I have 2 goals for this series, both of which are extremely lofty. First is to win a golden gnome. I think that I may have a legitimate shot at winning one of the art categories, and the goal felt lofty enough to push me to build something better than I ever have before. The second goal is to be commissioned by Gilded Games to make a diorama as a trophy. And by commissioned, I mean asked to make one for free that I could send to Soup, and Soup could send to the winner, or just send it to the winner directly. I just think this would be a cool way to get back to my second favorite series as well. And I don't in any way, shape, or form mean that as a slight. I absolutely love Gilded Games. Now, when I refer to this project as a series, I don't mean it in a traditional old school sense where I'm going to have a ton of episodes. This is going to be 2, maybe 3 episodes tops. The second episode being sculpting and third being painting, but if I can do them together, I definitely will. It will all depend on how well the sculpting goes. Speaking of which, please like and subscribe so that you can see part 2 and so that it can get my video pushed so that I can fulfill these goals. One point I want to touch on is sailing. Why am I not in the race for 99 sailing? Well, my adult diapers didn't come in time, so I realized that the XP waste was going to be too great if I had to go to the bathroom and I would never be able to make it first. But seriously, congratulations to Asian Grinder for being the first to 99 sailing. That is insane. Anyways, back to the craft. The most difficult part of this build by far was making the railings. I spent 4 or 5 days just working out how to make these railings. I did a lot of different tests and tried to build them a lot of different ways, eventually landing on making a stencil out of cardboard and then getting some very thin sheets stacked on top of each other and tracing over them. I had to only do a few sheets at a time, otherwise the details would get obscured farther down the line. So I had to go through and do this process maybe 7 or 8 times with these sheets, and then I can just mirror the individual pieces. One of the details that I added in that wasn't there is actually making these parts that jut out have individual stones carved into them. I decided to do this because of this drawing. I like the extra details that they added in to make the theater look more dramatic. After this was done, I glued the railings in place. I wanted to wait until the very end to glue the railings because they are extremely fragile. These are out of very thin pieces and all of the pieces are individually glued together. The only piece that is a single piece is the bottom strip that all of the railings sit on. You can see here I'm cutting out the individual spikes that sit between each of the railings. So I made a perfectly spaced gap between each of the railings on the top so that in between each where there's a support pillar, there's room on the very top to have the spikes sticking out. The next order of business was to make the roofs. You know what I mean. These are curved and also have some kind of pseudo 3-dimensional shingles on them. So it took me a little bit of time to work out how to do this. I've never really done curved surfaces like this, and I did a bit of experimentation, and I found the best way to do this was to create the size of the base of the roof and then create the size of the peak of the roof and make these generally the same shape. And then you can measure a piece that is the bottom width and then the top width, and then draw a curved line connecting those 2 pieces and do that for all of the sides around. These definitely want to come apart, so I needed to reinforce the corners, which also lined up with how the buildings looked, which was pretty lucky. So for this, I just had a really thin piece of foam, and then I put a indentation directly down the middle so that I could fold it in half, and then I could glue it to the corners. This not only reinforced the structure, it actually looked more like the building as well. The top and bottom are made exactly the same as each other, so there's not a lot of need for me to explain this all over again, but I'm going to go ahead and include the sequences and just let you listen to the music. This song is by Dadlegs, and it's actually inspired by Sea Shanty 2, but it's a completely original work. So a huge thank you to my good friend Dadlegs for making an original composition just for this video. So at this point I had most of the build completed, so I went back and started adding in some details. Some of the pyramid type shapes came off throughout the course of building this. I was actually gluing them on with Elmer's glue most of the time because this has a much longer working time than hot glue, so you can actually move it around. And then I went on to making the shingles. All of the shingles I made out of very small tiny squares. Originally, I was placing them each on with tweezers, and this turned out to be taking way too long, so I decided to paint on some clear Elmer's glue and then just put handfuls of these squares down, and I could just kind of move them around within that glue and just allow it to dry later. I included a zoomed in shot just so you can see how small this detail actually is. When trying to make it fit with the curved edges of the roof, working out this detail felt worse than grinding out my BOFA. I actually thought this so much that I went back and I ran CG again just for the hell of it, and yeah, this was actually worse. But like with all good things in life, the more painful and tedious, usually the better the result you get. The last thing that I did was the windows. I just did a freehand cut of something that I drew out, and then I glued it in place. And that pretty much wrapped it up. So here's what we're working with going into the sculpting phase of this project.
Anyways, be sure to like and subscribe, drop a comment for the algorithm. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.